Good afternoon, all. Today I'll be presenting a topic regarding Fannie Lou Hamer's impact on the community during the Civil Rights era. My general purpose is to persuade you, my specific purpose to persuade you listeners into believing that Fannie Lou Hamer's voice inspired civic virtue and built up the community during the Civil Rights era. And I'll now begin my speech. Success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed. This was a quote by Booker T. Washington. This quote provides that the challenges faced in life and how one approaches them determine results. The civil rights era demanded compelling voices that would penetrate the minds of oppressors in society. In doing so, there was a need for effective orators. Now, in defining a good man speaking well, Cantillon identified a perfect orator as one who was publicly active, possessed both integrity and eloquence, frequently made efforts to learn, and one who courageously pursued his ideas. Fannie Lou Hamer was born in 1917, the 20th child of Lou Ella and James Lee Towson, who were sharecroppers east of the Mississippi Delta. She first joined her family on the cotton fields at the age of 6. Hamer was able to balance obtaining knowledge through school while picking hundreds of pounds of cotton on a daily basis. Hamer's literary skills ultimately earned her a job as a timekeeper, which was one that was less physically demanding and more prestigious within the sharecropping system. Many civil violations pushed her to the spearhead of the civil rights movement. However, she took it upon herself to vigorously defend the presence and the power of the African American community. During the course of her activism, she was victimized by police brutality as she was savagely beaten in a Mississippi jail for her civil rights activities. Accordingly, at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, Fannie Lou Hamer delivered a compelling testimony to the Credentials Committee of the Democratic National Convention, which was intended to greatly impact civic virtue and uplift communities. Now, I will move into my first point regarding civic virtue. The United States founders believed that certain civic virtues were required of citizens in order for a successful constitution. Virtue is a combination of thoughts, words, and actions. Words can describe virtuous acts or traits, but can never themselves be virtuous. One's thoughts and words don't make a person virtuous. One must act upon them. Behavior can be virtuous only when done in pursuit of justice. Hamer utilized her authoritative tone in order to assemble justice for African Americans in the community. She was passionate about voting and volunteering as she believed that they were a part of her civic duty. Hamer's life was filled with public reminders that America's vision of democracy was incongruent with its mortifying reality. Voting is the act of giving or registering to vote. Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the moving spirits of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The MFDP was founded on April 26, 1964, in honor of the Voter Registration Project for African Americans in the state of Mississippi. Mississippi blacks had been making strenuous efforts to obtain justice for voting. Specifically, Hamer was among many advocates who deemed it crucial to confront the Democratic Convention's Credential Committee. She used the rhetoric of imitation in order to assert the oppressive structure in society. Hamer resembled civil rights figures such as Rosa Parks, Shirley Chisholm, Septima Clark, Angela Davis, Joanne Robinson, Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and many other civil rights activists. Many of these prominent figures spoke with eloquence, integrity, and knowledge as a combative force against injustice. While attending the convention, Hamer rendered a testimony that was assertive enough to gain national publicity. Her tone issued a sense of non-resistance, exhaustion, and struggle. Hamer's primary objective was to move delegates with her powerful delivery mechanisms, despite the level of humility she may have faced. Thus, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and in the following years, the Democratic Party ensured fair participation and stopped discriminating against African Americans. Additionally, MFDP members were seated as delegates to the Democratic National Convention as loyal Democrats of Mississippi at the 1968 Democratic Convention. Also, Fannie Lou Hamer was elected as the National Democratic Party delegate for the 1972 National Convention in Miami Beach. Now, in reference to her volunteer work, the act of volunteering involved significant contributions. Fannie Lou Hamer used her talents in order to unify segments of the community. Through volunteering, she exerted a high degree of self-governance, which allowed for her to operate in a manner that was unbothered by the chaos during the Civil Rights era. Through 1962 and 1963, Hamer worked for desegregation and voter registration. She was profoundly involved in relief work, where she distributed donated food and clothes among the less fortunate of the Delta residents where she had once resided. Hamer was highly sympathetic to the economic struggles that fueled the Civil Rights era, as she was herself inflicted with poverty throughout her entire life. With her authoritative voice, she was able to leverage her donations and distributions as a tactic for yielding votes. Her confidence in elevating civic virtue for African Americans enabled her to build courage, which was reflected in her speaking patterns. I will now move on to my second point regarding community advancement. At the Democratic National Convention in 1964, Hamer spoke on the behalf of the Black community as well as many others. Both the content of her speech and delivery tactics manifested a yearn for community advancement. Hamer pursued efforts through activism and community organizations in order to compile a force that was massive enough to dominate the systematic oppression that governed society. In relation to her activism and organizations, Hamer was a devoted activist who sought civic virtue and community engagement. Her activism began in the 1950s when she attended several annual conferences of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, organized by Dr. T.R.M. Howard, a wealthy businessman and civil rights leader in the all-black town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi. Further, in 1961, Hamer was sterilized without her knowledge or consent by a white doctor as a part of the state of Mississippi's plan to reduce the number of impoverished blacks in the state. She viewed her circumstances as an obligation to move as a unit with others and like-minded people, in which she would exercise her passion through community organizations in order to combat this force. It was then on August 23, 1962, after being influenced by Reverend James Bevel, she volunteered to become an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, to help Black Mississippians register to vote. Further, in 1964, Hamer became one of the statewide leaders in the Freedom Summer Campaign, which brought hundreds of volunteers from across the nation to Mississippi to help with voter registration. Since the Democratic Party in Mississippi prohibited Black participation, activists arose across the state of Mississippi and created the MFDP. Hamer was credited as one of the co-founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Hamer and other MFD leaders traveled to the National Convention in Atlantic City to dispute their lack of acknowledgement in Democratic conventions. She asserted the white-dominated delegation from Mississippi and demanded more of a diverse community. Throughout the course of her speech, the level of her assertion gradually rose, to which officials deemed it necessary to broadcast her testimony. As a result, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued an emergency presidential press conference to prevent her testimony from being telecasted. In imitation of other prominent civil rights activists, her testimony described the oppressive conditions she and other Black Mississippians faced regularly and demanded recognition of the MFDP. She believed that such recognition would encourage African American voters to be more engaged in voting activities, which could ultimately heighten the likelihood of who is elected. In conclusion, Fannie Lou Hamer's speech delivered at the 1964 Democratic National Convention was compelling enough to impact civic virtue and communities. During a time of segmentation and struggle, Hamer exhibited bravery and resilience in order to facilitate access to privileges that were bestowed upon American citizens. Her level of knowledge on the social justices that fueled society, civil laws, and rights allowed for her to validate that liberty and justice was not applicable to all during that era. Her vision of exercising civic virtue and cultivating society for African Americans was a result of the obstacles she faced. And as Frederick Douglass had once stated, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And that concludes my speech. So I would really like to thank you listeners for sitting in today and hearing my opinion on Fannie Lou Hamer and her impact on society during the Civil Rights era. And I really hope that this speech was resourceful to you and you tune in next time to more topics that I have to discuss.